At the turn of the 19th century, different ideas started to emerge about cultural differences. Franz Baum, called the father of American anthropology, because his theoretical and methodological contributions to the field were so impactful then and still continue to underpin much of what we do today. So he basically, two kind of things I'll draw out for you. He lays waste to the ideas of racial scientists, this idea of biological determinism. And he also challenges and overturns the ideas of the unilineal evolutionists. So first, he's just real quickly, he opposed this idea that race and biology determines differences among societies. At the time, people were talking about race as if it was this biological reality and that races are set and immutable. And that's not true. And Franz Baum showed that. He did this study looking at over 17,000 people. That's a good sample size. And what he looked at is he was measuring individuals from countries in Europe that had either grown up in Europe and immigrated over as adults to the US, or that had been born, like their parents immigrated over to the US and they were born in the US, but genetically they come from that population in these European countries. So let's just take Germany to make it simple. What he showed is that if you measure individuals that are born and raised in Germany, they have certain cranial morphology, certain stature, certain physical traits. If you then measure people from that exact same population in Germany, except for the parents immigrated to the US before they had their kid, and so then their child was born but grew up in the US rather than in Germany. And what he found is if you compare these parent populations and the ones that grew up in the US, extremely different biology, different height, different cranial structure. Basically what it showed, so both populations come from the same gene pool, but they're growing up on the one hand in either Germany or France or Spain or the UK, and on the other hand in the US. Totally different biology. And it just shows that this idea of immutable races isn't true. It doesn't hold up. The environment plays a huge role in our development and how we sort of turn out. And he also challenged the unilineal thinking at the time. Don't worry about that arrow. So let's talk about that. Him and his students basically turned unilineal evolution on its head. And their main concept, something called historical particularism. What Boas said is every culture is really a unique product of its own historical circumstances, its own particular historical circumstances. Different cultures and different environments are subjected to different pressures to which they respond. And so it doesn't progress in this line from savage to barbaric to civilized. The Kung develop in their own environment, subjected to their own pressures, develop in their own way. They're unique in their own right. Same for European groups, same for the Japanese, same for the Inuit, sort of Eskimos is the other term that you might be more familiar with. Each culture is a unique product of its own historical circumstances, the own pressures that it's subjected to over time. And so really each is unique in its own right and therefore should be studied that way, right? Remember, the unilinealists didn't study each culture in its own right. They basically took themselves, put themselves on the top, and then placed everyone else according to how closely they matched the Europeans. Incorrect, inaccurate, ethnocentric. So in his Boas's thinking, historical particularism, that each culture is unique and should be understood and studied that way. He also emphasized learning and enculturation as key processes, right? People, groups are different, not because of biology, not because of God, not because they're naturally better, but because of what they learn, because of what their surroundings, what they're subjected to. He also is responsible for this notion of cultural relativity, this hallmark concept in anthropology that I introduced way back when. Again, this idea that no one culture is inherently superior or inferior, right? They're different for different reasons. And we're going to start looking at what leads to the differences actually today. Just a few other things about Franz Boas. He's responsible for a lot of the methods and the theories, again, that still underpin the field today. He also popularized this tradition of ethnographic fieldwork, right? Firsthand fieldwork, actually go out and live with the people that you're trying to understand. Try to get that emic perspective. That's the only way to begin to understand the other, not relying on secondhand accounts sitting in your office, like reading about someone's subjective notions of what they saw. He emphasized careful collection of data, right? So collect actual data about what's going on rather than just sort of using your own ideas to make inferences. And again, this idea of objectivity, in quotes, because we can never fully be objective, but this notion that when you go do field work, be culturally relative. You need to suspend your value judgments, your notions of morality or nudity or hygiene, because people have different views and values on those things for different reasons. Much of that, how you see that, is cultural. There's nothing sort of natural or inevitable about your views, right? A lot of it's just learned, and we all learn different things. He did extensive field work among the Inuit. It's not easy field work. You're in another, culture or country, that can be challenging, rewarding, but challenging. Usually you need to learn the language, right? That's not easy. He's in the Arctic, up in the Arctic Circle in like sometimes minus 50-degree weather, right? So it's not sort of a vacation, but it's so, so important to actually go do that field work. It's key. This is just to show you the distribution of some of the different groups, native groups up among the Arctic area in Arctic countries. You don't need to know that. I just wanted to show you sort of where we're talking about. And for Franz Boas's purposes, because we're talking about over here. Again, I won't ask you about that. So today, no one theory dominates contemporary anthropology, but Boasian ideas and ethics still underlie pretty much every framework, right? Ideas of cultural relativity, suspending value judgments, field work. Today, most cultural anthropologists fall into one of two schools of thought, and that's materialist anthropology or interpretative anthropology. I'll say it both, it's synonymous, whichever way I say it. So we're going to talk about both those in detail in just a moment. But before moving on, just a few unresolved questions in anthropology. So the goal of anthropology is to sort of understand human behavior, but can and should cultural anthropology be a science? And this is, again, people don't agree on this. Science, Western science, the scientific method, you sort of develop a hypothesis, collect data, to experiment, test that hypothesis, develop your conclusion. And then the whole goal or idea behind the scientific method is that you lay it out so that someone else that doesn't even know you can come along, read your work, and replicate that experiment and get the same results. So that you're actually testing the phenomenon rather than the results reflecting the experimenter's own biases, right? Kind of like the unilineal evolutionists. And this is tricky when we're talking about studying humans. Humans are not objects to be manipulated, right? They have minds of their own, agency of their own. And ethically, right, you can't do controlled experiments with humans. And the Tuskegee syphilis experiments, for those of you that aren't familiar, back in, I don't know, maybe the 1930s, don't worry about the dates, but earlier in the 1900s, they did an experiment, and it was Black African-American males. Most had syphilis, some didn't, and they were just tracking what was happening. Well, the experiment lasted 40 years plus. 10 years into the experiment, penicillin, sort of a treatment for syphilis, had come along and was being used, but they didn't tell the African-American men in the study that there was a treatment for them. And they actually kind of lied to them and told them, you got free healthcare for the rest of your life. That's how they got them to get into the study. And so many of them died from untreated syphilis, which gets quite nasty, quite painful. And this went on. They had penicillin for over 30 years while still running this experiment, not treating people, just letting them sort of die from this disease so they could track the progression of the disease, right? And you can't do that kind of shit. So we have institutional review boards and processes you have to go through before you can do research to make sure you're not going to be pulling that kind of stuff. Experimentation aside, even so, setting that aside, humans themselves as the observer, as the scientist, we can never fully pull ourselves out of our own cultural framework through which we see the world. So how can we ever really be fully objective? And objectivity is a problem not just for anthropology, it's a problem for all science. Be wary of people that tell you they're absolutely objective, because it's not really possible. And so at least be aware of where your biases might be, right? So you can correct for that instead of pretending like you're being objective. Another unresolved question: what are the most useful concepts or to focus on when we're trying to study diversity? What holds the most explanatory power? Should we look at the environment and adaptation? Should we look at worldview and religion and what people think and how that drives behavior? Anthropologists don't agree. We'll sort of look at both sides of that. And last, when we do field work, whose representations should we use? Do we represent what the anthropologist, the ethnographer, the scientist has observed, sort of that Oedic perspective? Or do we privilege the emic perspective, what others are sort of telling us? And let me give you an example to show you what I mean. In Solomon Islands, they are like 95% Christian, different sects, but by and large, right, they've been missionized and they follow Christianity. But they'll still talk about their old custom religion, right? And they'll always say, before they talk about it, say, we don't believe this anymore. But, and then they tell you this really cool fucking story about something. And so do I, as the anthropologist, do I report on sort of just the emic, which is what they'll tell you is they're Christian. We do not believe in custom anymore, the pagan religion. The term applied by Christians, the Solomon Islanders don't mean it negatively, how it was applied. Do I just report on what they're telling me, that they're Christian, that they go to church? Or do I also report the edict, kind of what I've seen, which is that there's still some healing ceremonies going on. There's still some use of the traditional religion definitely going on, right? And especially if the point is to give people their voice, right? Should I be saying what they're telling me, or do I add in also what I'm seeing, right? Unresolved questions, things to keep in mind. Okay, and so today there's these two broad schools of thought that anthropologists fall under. Epistemologies. And epistemology is a way of knowing, right? Epistemology is sort of the study of knowledge, right? How it's formulated, in what context, what's the approach, what's the form of understanding. In all ways of knowing, all epistemologies have limitations inherent in them. And so the two main approaches, the first is the scientific epistemology. These folks that fall under the scientific school of thought would say the primary goals in cultural anthropology are to explain cultural differences and similarities. Why do they exist? Why do we see this here and that there? Why do cultures change over time? They would say that humans are different from other animals in degree, not kind. And so in the same way you can study other species' behavior, you can do that with humans as well. They would emphasize relationships with the environment, right? How can we understand human variation as a result of environmental adaptation, adapting to different environments? In short, the scientific folks, they're interested in generalized explanations to explain cultural variation. Other anthropologists would say that humans and human culture behavior is way too complex for any one theory or explanation to actually capture it, to actually explain it. Unlike the motions of waves or the movement of electrons that are really predictable via Western science, people have brains, they have agency, they can make decisions, they can change their mind. And so they can't be reduced down to a simple explanation. And the folks that argue this, that reject the scientific approach, they fall under this humanistic school of thought. They reject attempts to explain culture in general, say it can't be done. Culture, humanity, too complex, cannot be done. And so their main goal is to describe other cultures and interpret what's going on inside that group. What has meaning for them? What's the emic perspective? How do they understand the world? Just simply to understand what's going on in that culture. How do things work for them? And also to give people a voice, right, to represent them. They wouldn't worry about general explanations or environmental adaptation. They're interested in symbols, right? What's the meaning of this in that culture? What has meaning for the people? What's the emic? Okay, so sort of scientists, we want generalized explanations. We think that can be done. Humanists, no, it can't. Human behavior is way too complex. You're fooling yourselves. And at best, just try to understand this specific culture and what has meaning for them, what's going on in there. That's really the best you can do. So even in the field, anthropologists take different approaches. The two approaches that reflect these fundamental epistemological differences are materialist anthropologists that fall under that scientific school of thought. And then there's interpretative anthropology, which falls under that humanistic sort of school of thought. We're going to start with material anthropology. The materialists say their focus is on the material forces. Don't conflate material with your own notions of what that means. We're not talking about like clothes and money. We're talking about tangible things rather than intangible things. So like the resources in your environment, that's tangible. The ideas in your head, intangible for our purposes. So the material forces, they'd say that's what drives the cultural system. What are the material forces? They include subsistence patterns. How do people make a living in their environment? Are they hunter-gatherers? Are they farmers? Are they fishers? Are they pastoralists? Do they work for wages like us? What's their subsistence pattern? Their technology. How do they exploit resources in their environment? The tools, but also the knowledge required, right? With Kung, very simple sort of technology in terms of, they have digging sticks instead of like tractors, but intricate knowledge of their environment. And then the economic patterns, meaning who controls the economy? Is it like the Kung, where sort of everyone's involved, procuring food, contributing, sharing, everyone has a say? Or is it more like us, where a very small handful of people control most of the decision-making, the power that affects all of us, right? Who sort of controls, who has the power? And all of these things, the material forces, are shaped by the physical environment in which people live. This is materialist anthropology. So the key is to understand how environmental circumstances limit the material forces. For example, again, you're not going to become a fisherman in the middle of the Kalahari Desert. It's not an option, right? The environment limits that. It presents certain opportunities while precluding others. So how does the environment shape the subsistence, the technology, the economic patterns? And then in turn, how do those material forces shape other aspects of the culture, like population size or social organization or equality or lack thereof? And one of the key focuses for materialists is adaptation. It's all about how does this culture reflect adaptation to this environment? Examples. And we'll talk about this again, but maybe take a few notes. They just have pictures on the slide for the examples. Okay, so I'm going to explain the Kung and then also the Aztecs from a materialist anthropological approach. And materialists would say the most important thing for people is meeting their basic needs, food, shelter, water. And so the way in which people are able to meet these needs in their environment, that's most important. And that will influence other aspects of the culture. As the way people organize in their environment around their resources, they might become hunter-gatherers, farmers, fishers, whatever. And as the way that people organize around that resource base changes, other aspects of the culture will also change. Okay, so Kung from a materialist approach. The Kung are hunter-gatherers. And one of the reasons that that's their subsistence strategy is because they live in the Kalahari. The environment has lots of resources, but they're patchy and they're somewhat unpredictable. They depend on when the rains come. It can vary widely. And so because they rely on wild game and wild plants, there's only so many edible items in a given area. It can't support large population levels, right? And so what we see is these low, what we call band level population among the Kung, small bands of maybe 10 to 30 people scattered around the landscape, separated by geography, but interconnected through kinship and marriage. And they're nomadic also, because as resources get depleted in one area, they'll move on to the next, right? Nomadic. Because they're nomadic, they don't really have a lot of possessions. You only have really what you can carry. Also, they have what we call an egalitarian social organization, meaning everyone's roughly equal to one another. Very different from our experience here in the US. And so within Kung societies, egalitarian group, sharing, especially of food, is so important. And it's a built-in way, it's adaptive in an environment where resources are patchy and unpredictable, so that you go out gathering or hunting and you come back successful and you share, because you know that the next time when you come back empty-handed, people will share with you. And so it's adaptive, this generalized reciprocity in which everyone shares the meat, everyone shares the food, everyone's needs are met in this way. Again, adaptive in an environment where resources are unpredictable. Because sharing and this sort of equal nature of the group members is so important, it's so key to their survival, making sure everyone's taken care of, it's actually reflected in specific customs that the Kung practice. So there's this custom called insulting the meat. I had a teacher that used to call it beating the meat, which is not what it's called. It's inappropriate. Insulting the meat. We're going to read about this after the exam, a short classic piece. Nisa keeps talking about Richard and Nancy. Richard Lee writes a piece about this that we'll take a look at later. A hunter comes back and has killed something. And as you know, the Kung get very excited about this. Meat is highly prized. What'd you get? What'd you get? The villagers come up and ask the hunter, what'd you get? Come on, you've been gone all day. You must have got something good. And the hunter says, no. Shameful, right? He just looks down. No, come on. And this goes on for a while. They keep asking him. No, come on. So the hunter finally says, maybe I got something small. Everyone gets really excited at this point because they know he has got something big and that everyone's going to be eating meat for several days. And so what you're seeing is it's this humbling mechanism. It's a social leveling mechanism where even though they ridicule the hunter, they ridicule the kill. They say, you suck and we're all going to go hungry, even while they're shoving the meat in their mouth. What it does is it keeps people from becoming big-headed and from boasting, which can sort of threaten that sharing nature of the group and also create fighting and tension. And so in a society where sharing is so important, it's manifests in these customs, insulting the meat, where they make fun of the hunters, especially the most successful ones, to keep people cool-headed from becoming sort of prideful and maybe threatening that sharing nature of the group. And so materialist approach, all the way from patchy resource environment in the Kalahari to sort of band level, small populations, egalitarian social organization, sharing, all the way up to customs like insulting the meat, right? Materialist approach, how people adapt in their environment, that will shape other aspects of the culture. There's another example you read about in Nisa, and there's a 3 to 4 year birth interval among the Kung. And this is from a material approach, this is adaptive in their environments. Well, just real quick, does anyone remember why? Why do the Kung space their children out? They don't give birth any closer than 3 to 4 years together. And there's reasons for this. Did anyone sort of catch it in the reading? Yeah, Emma, go ahead.
Is it so the children can like breastfeed for a longer period of time?
Yes, perfect. Textbook. Because in the Kalahari, bush foods are rough for a young child's stomach. They're hard to digest. And so women, females, breastfeed for up to till the child's 3 or 4 years old. If they stop breastfeeding sooner than that, it might be difficult for the child to actually get proper nutrition. And you don't want to have a child too soon, like say a couple years after you've just had one, because you still need to breastfeed that older child, but you'd also need to breastfeed the new infant. And there's not enough, a female cannot sort of produce enough breast milk from the calories she's intaking to breastfeed both at the same time. So if the births happen too close together, it threatens the health of the infant, of the older child, and of the mother, right? All three of them could end up sort of dying. And so they have this deliberate spacing out of births to make sure that they're not had too close together. Another really important reason is because when you go out gathering as a female, your kids come with you, especially infants, because you're breastfeeding. And so you want to make sure that that older child is old enough to sort of walk on their own, because it's very difficult to carry the infant plus the older child plus 10, 20, 30 pounds of bush foods that you're bringing back to the village. So materialists would say this is adaptive in this environment, this birth interval. It actually reflects adaptation to the environment. Another, just real quick, something that came up in your film reflections from Nye was Nisa getting married at such a young age. And so in the reading for today, they address this. It's not that Nisa's engaging in sex or even a relationship with the husband when she gets married at 8 years old. The relationship, the marriage is really symbolic. And the reason why the Kung often will have their daughters marry at a younger age is that the husband will come, the groom will come and live with the Kung and hunt for the family. And it gives the parents a chance to see, is he going to take care of my daughter? Is he going to provide for her? And it brings resources into the village. And it ties the different villages together so that if the watering hole over here is dried up, hey, we have intermarriage ties. We have kin over here. Let's go over here. And so I wanted to bring it up because a lot of you had sort of spoke to that and were surprised by that. And so it's not like that they're actually having sex and doing all these things that we think of as marriage. It's sort of symbolic, and there's reasons for it, right? Okay, let's see if we can do the Aztecs real quick, and then we'll just end where we end, and that's fine. We'll pick up next time. The Aztecs, they at some point picked up farming. When you switch to farming, you're no longer relying on just wild game and wild plants. You have now converted that entire area to edible food, right? Because you've domesticated, you're planting crops. So say you have an acre in the Kalahari, maybe there's some sour plums here or a spring hare there. If you have an acre in Mesoamerica, you have the Aztecs, they've converted that whole space to food. It results in what we call surplus, so that you don't actually need everyone in the population procuring food. You only need a proportion of the population growing food to produce enough to feed everyone. That's true for us too, right? Like one farmer in the US feeds 120 something other people. And so what this does is it frees people up to do other things. And also people stop moving around. They become not nomadic, but sedentary. They're no longer moving around because they don't need to. The food's being grown in one place. They're investing in the land. You start seeing much larger population sizes because you can support a larger population in that area. You're producing more food. You only have some people farming. It frees people up to do other stuff, and they start specializing along occupational lines. Maybe they start developing new technologies or metallurgy or religious or political officials or military. These people start specializing. And so over time, you're sedentary, you're not moving around. You can also start accumulating wealth, not just within one's lifetime, but over several generations. You also see what we call social stratification. So through these differences in work, in status, and also differences in wealth that begin to accumulate, this is the emergence of inequality. This is the emergence of different social classes with differential access to resources that can even become hereditary over time. This in turn can lead to changes in worldview, such as religious beliefs, like the divine right to rule. Among the Aztecs, kings were considered half god, half man, and therefore they were literally chosen by the supernatural beings to be in charge. Religious belief that reinforces the right to rule. Aztecs explain from a material approach. Okay, this is sort of a schematic of what it looks like. The weakness of the material approach is the strength of the other approach we'll pick up with on Tuesday, which is the interpretive approach. Yeah, environment's important, but worldview, what people think, this can also be a driving force.